Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. I'm joined by Amatey Doku, who's an experienced communicator with a passion for public policy. He's worked with senior leaders across higher education at government, sector, and university level. Amatey was deputy president of the National Union of Students, and before that was the president of the Society National Union of Students at Cambridge. In that role, he has or been a kind of member of numerous higher education sector agency boards, including Quality Assurance Agency, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and the Office of Independent Adjudicators. He led on the publication of a seminal and groundbreaking report into the BME attainment gap alongside Universities UK. He's also a non-executive director of Advanced HE. And prior to joining the NUS, Amatey was doing a lot of work at Cambridge around external relations and overhauling the organization's governance structures. In that capacity, he was nominated as a trustee of the University of Cambridge. His influential work includes leading that joint project with the Universities UK and producing the Closing the Gap report with clear recommendations for the higher education sector to take action on. He's worked with various sector bodies, as mentioned, and worked with UPP Foundation as part of its Civic University Commission, leading to several key recommendations and cross-party buy-in from various political parties. He enjoys tackling difficult problems and encouraging others to think outside the box. He also champions the need for qualitative experiences to be at the heart of evidence-based approaches. And outside of his kind of day-to-day work, Amatey has a strong interest in tackling structural inequalities, as well as a keen advocate for the music and the arts. As of this recording, he was announced as a new board member of the Guildhall School of Music and Arts. And I'd just like to say, welcome, Amatey. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Nathan. Really good to be here.
Awesome. So I guess to kick off, and really what I want to focus on in this session is a lot's happened pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, but I feel like we're at this stage of everyone's kind of coming back to campus, things are turning back to a sort of normal. How can we start thinking about inclusivity, and I will say specifically racial inclusivity, in a practical way as we return to campus?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the context is really important as well. There's a lot of thinking happening in universities at the moment, both the immediate challenges in terms of how do we get people back to campus safely, and what does that look like, and how do we support students and staff as they potentially navigate a new normal, as it were, with a sort of blended offer for students, a blended or hybrid working for staff. So there's a lot of immediate challenges, but it, because the context in which we're coming back to universities is also very different, there are lots more conversations happening about the future, and I think that's really, really positive. I think when we think about how to create inclusive organizations and kind of the practical steps that need to be taken, it's really in, and this almost sounds like it's a sort of tautology in terms of repeating itself, but it's in the evidence of the practical steps that are happening.
Right.
So if a lot of this conversation so far has happened in panel events, speaking engagements, think pieces, people committing and saying that this is the right thing to be doing. But can you quickly and concretely find the evidence of what steps are being taken and the progress that's been made
Right.
against those steps? And actually, a lot of institutions fall short on that. So there isn't a clear plan in place. Nobody owns it, and I can't see over time what progress has been made along the journey. And that's one of the things that often we work with lots of institutions to nail down. If we take a step back and look at all your current plans that you've got to tackle racial inequality, to tackle other forms of discrimination, and put them all together, is that actually going to change a specific set of key measures or or key things that you're looking at, and if not, then you've got to invest in it. You've got to put more resource. You've got to think of more practical steps. And I think that's the bit that people often don't do. They think that if we just talk enough about it and say we're committed to it, we'll see change. And in reality, in universities, that's not how these things work.
Right, awesome. One of the things that I was thinking about, specifically around this theme of ownership, because on one side we have the thought process that it is a whole institutional responsibility now. On the other side, we know that somebody has to drive things forward and almost have that responsibility. How do you see ownership taking shape to actually make change in this area? Is it champions or is it not? Is it local leadership in terms of departments and faculties, or is it one person having that responsibility and oversight for the whole university? What does ownership kind of look like towards this for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a really, really critical issue. I think there's a sort of finely balanced approach that needs to be taken with this. As you said, it is everybody's responsibility, but there are people who have expertise and need to, and that expertise needs to be leveraged internally. But you can't have one without the other, and I think that's the critical point. And the way I think about it is that, given that it needs to happen at every level, staff members at that level need to have ownership of some element of EDI, and there are very few parts of the institution which I think there shouldn't be that focus. Right. And I can come on to that in a bit. But also at every level, that person needs to both be able to engage with, tap into, be influenced by somebody who can give them that expert view of what they need to be doing. And also that person needs to have the clout at that level to be able to actually drive change.
Right. Yeah.
So if you think about it in the sort of traditional structures, and we can kind of debate whether the bureaucratic structures are the right ones for universities to work in. But if you take, for example, at the exec level, in everybody's key performance indicators at the exec level, they need to be driving this agenda as part of that. But you also need somebody at that seat who has that specifically in their remit to really to be leading on some of those projects, to be driving change. And the way I see it is that person's role at that level, but also at every level, is, as I said, to influence, to convene, to challenge and confront people, and to be that person that they are accountable to in some cases, but really to put the options on the table, and for the others then to take that work forward in their own areas, in their own departments as well. It shouldn't all be left to them, that individual, to drive things. But you do need that at lots of levels as well. So you can't rely on a chief diversity officer just to drive it at the senior management level. You've got to think about who has responsibility for it in the schools and the faculties, in the departments, and also then at the board level as well. And together, those joined up experts, alongside making sure that everybody who's working with them at that level has it in written into their performance indicators. That's how the structure really needs to work together.
Right. And do you see something similar from the bottom up kind of ownership perspective? So because often we see it from the top level down, and it's almost I think the difficulty, especially with something like this, is it can't be instruction based. It can't just be, here's the line, everyone's got to meet it. What does bottom up ownership look like to you, I guess?
It's a really good question. And I think there'll be lots of different views on this. So that, and I guess it depends which parts of the institution we're looking at, and right, what is their role within this. So I still think that there's a lot that institutions aren't doing that, in my view, should just be standard practice. And I think a lot of the work we do is just getting them to that point.
Right. Okay.
So are you tracking staff engagement data by ethnicity and then putting in plans to improve that? Have you looked at the promotion panels and criteria and the disparities there, and is there a plan in place to address that when it comes to recruitment?
Right.
a lot of those things, a lot of those structures that's not something that, whilst from a bottom-up perspective, people should be raising those things, or you would expect
Yeah,
people to be raising those things. It's not really the responsibility for them to address some of those
understand.
more technical aspects. I
Right.
think where bottom-up things work well is where people have ideas about how to improve things, and there's a clear forum and a space for them to channel that, and they're listened to. And critically, there's a distinction as well between hearing people's views and perspectives on what should change,
Hmm.
but not necessarily trying to ask for their expertise on how to change it.
Right.
So somebody
Okay.
should, from the bottom up perspective, people should be given spaces to say, look, it would be really helpful if I was better supported at this part of my journey, or this aspect of my experience is not good. In
Mm.
terms of the organizational structures and designs and changes that need to be, made in order to change those experiences, that's something that the institution needs to take forward and not rely on those bottom up. So I think there's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one.
Mm.
But I think it works really well, particularly around awareness raising and driving the conversation and bringing people in the conversation. If those perspectives and experiences from in some extent community organizing principles
Mm.
can be harnessed, you can get a really good balance where, from a sort of technical point of view and sorting the organizational structures out, the organization is making progress there, but you have a more vibrant conversation from the bottom up, supported by funding where necessary, space, the platform that the institution can give. And that's not really necessarily always being directed by the institution, particularly, I think, when it comes to educating staff and
Mm.
students on these issues as well. I think there's a dual role there
I
that
think that
different
I
stakeholders can
just,
play.
yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I hadn't really thought about it in that way. But that space, a space to be created, in order to unearth what needs to be changed or how someone could be supported in their role and what they do day to day, and not necessarily how the change should be done. And I guess what might have happened in the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years could be this dictate of this needs to be changed, this outcome data needs to be changed, and this is how we want you to do it, without really understanding what the challenges and barriers are. And in my experience, some of the challenges and barriers haven't even been obvious at all. It could be not wanting to speak about certain issues or not knowing how to navigate conversations around this. Um, what do you feel, and I guess, what do you feel is missing from the conversation on making inclusivity happen?
Yeah, I mean, a really good question. We're starting to see the shift. I think the level at which this conversation is happening is now different.
Right.
Prior to only a couple of years back, it was very much the purview of the EDI teams, which were sort of buried in HR,
Mm.
um, not just in higher education, but across different sectors. There was a bit of a there has certainly been more resource given to some of these units as well, and I'm not sure whether for those of you for those people who are on the HERAG higher education race list can see
Mm-hmm.
almost on a weekly basis some new advert going out for some new appointments
Mm.
in this space. So there's clearly clearly there's an interest there. I think what I think we've got to a space where I would say that most senior leaders would turn around and say, "This is a really important issue. We've got to do something about it." There are
Right.
regulatory requirements now. There are things. I would say more on the student side than on the staff side, but it's clearly getting on the agenda. I don't think we've quite yet got to the point where we've really understood what the scale of the challenge is and quite how many internal interdependencies there are to creating change. And also, I don't think we've really had the conversation of what are the really big structural barriers, which on the face of it might not have anything to do with race, but
Right.
really ultimately, if we don't fix that, we're not actually going to improve things. So
Right.
if, for example, your HR team is overworked, stressed out, using old legacy systems, you know, and is really struggling, you can't really expect to be making really strong progress in there, given that they are quite an important part to this
Right.
space. You know, you really have to be operating off the correct systems. You really need to be really on it when it comes to, you know, supporting staff and having that trust of the staff. There's a lot of talk about moving away from, you know, HR just being a kind of function where it just sort of churns out to being much more strategic and thinking about employee engagement, you know, how we're mapping the staff journey, what are we doing about the, you know, almost employee value proposition, all those sorts of things. If you're not really thinking about how to run a more sort of people-centered organization, and you're trying to, and we're still sort of in the sort of traditional bureaucratic model, we're really going to struggle to make progress here, because those two things are linked. And some of the perhaps quite radical suggestions around inclusivity, for example, some organizations, you know, just publishing the pay of everybody in the institute,
Right.
in the organization, so you can have an evidence-based conversation, particularly when it comes to gender equality. This has been seen, but we know that ethnicity pay gaps. You can have an evidence-based conversation on pay, because you can see where the gaps
You've done the data work, yeah.
Exactly. That kind of stuff feels quite far from where the sector is. And I think you've got to both be passionate about these things, care about these things, be willing to put them on the agenda, but be willing to take. I don't think we're quite at the stage where we've realized the link between having a more modern institution and an institution that can actually tackle some of these challenges.
I remember once hearing you speak, and you spoke about if universities approached it a bit more like, you know, the big four supermarkets, and, you know, collecting data to the point where we had a sense of knowing personas and knowing our staff and students a bit more intimately, and almost having an awareness of the different touch points that a person would go through within the institution. Does that require a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to technology and change, or is that something that universities can start to think about in different ways to at least start that journey?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, and maybe this is me sort of sounding like a classic management consultant, like I can't see many downsides to embracing to really challenging traditional bureaucratic structures and systems and old legacy systems and putting in place new ones. I can't see many arguments against that, other than it's a pretty challenging thing to do.
Right.
And that seems to be the main. It's challenging because universities have operated in the same sort of way for a very long time. They're big or in some cases big institutions. Even when they're not very big, they can be highly devolved. So trying to create change, you know, from the center is really challenging. And a lot of the infrastructure isn't often there for change management or that kind of program management approach. So when we're thinking about the scale of change that's required, whether it's digital transformation, whether that's, you know, thinking about that on the student side, on the staff side, these are big projects and big things that need to be invested in. I think they pay off, and I think if anything, we will be forced to go down that route eventually. We already are, arguably, but yeah, I think it's just that resistance to change, and that, in my view, is a real impediment to the inclusivity agenda as well. And I don't think we always make that link. If you think about, for example, even the traditional kind of structure and expectations of promotions and progression in densely bureaucratic organizations, where, you know, if you take professional services, for example, the only way you can really progress is if the person in the role above you leaves, or, you know, moves into another job, and really, other than that, it's difficult to kind of progress. There are lots of organizations which are thinking about that in new ways, how to make sure that staff can be transferred and engage across the institution to support progression. The more you go into that bureaucratic model, even though it's seen as, more kind of structured, you actually reinforce the old boys networks and the old boys clubs and the lack of transparency about how to progress, and often the expectation that you'll do your time before you can kind of make progress, and all that kind of old school way of looking at things. I mean, this is the way organizations have been structured and designed for hundreds of years, and they're still very they're still prevalent today. And I don't know whether the HE sector is going to be the when that new thinking is going to come to the sector, but I think if you really want to turbocharge the inclusivity agenda, you've got to really rethink the fundamentals of how organizations look and feel.
You mentioned about the promotions process in the pipeline, which is a particular area that shows there's quite a few disparities. Thinking of Black female professorship, so forth. For those who are watching, the data's come out that there are, I believe at the last count, 35 Black female professors in the UK out of a kind of cohort of maybe 19,000. And so already we start to see there are structural inequalities. Something along the way has happened that has created this. And if you get a chance, Dr. Nicola Rollock put out some research called Stay in Power, really interesting. That was out in 2019, to have a read of it. If we start to even think about those kinds of processes about who gets to senior positions and so forth, to what extent do we say it's the structures and mechanisms, and I guess technology, and to what extent is it our own biases about what a professor looks like or what a senior manager looks like in the institution?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely both. And you can have, as I said, you can have a dynamic institution which allows you to do all sorts, but still have these inequalities reinforced. And what I'm talking about really is about, I think the bureaucracy is a limiting factor, and the structures there is a real limiting factor to this. But you can't just expect that restructuring and will automatically improve things. I think the promotions and the representation issues is a really important one, as you said, that stat. And again, this goes back to, I don't think we've quite realized the scale of correction that's needed in this space. In a sense, there are three and probably more things that you need to do. But if you just take three, one obviously is the pipeline of students itself, and we know that there's a huge drop off of particularly students of color going into postgraduate research roles, and there's a real kind of drop off there. But let's say even today, we fixed the pipeline, we did everything, and we had the same kind of proportions of students getting through the system. We're not going to end up with people on senior management positions and for at least another 20 years plus, right? So that's, you can't just do that and expect that once we fix that will be fine, because that's not soon enough or good enough. Then it's the issue around which people have looked at, which is around the retention. And again, linked to the bureaucracy point, if as an organization you're not set up to have really to have really intentional really intentional ways of mapping the experience of all your staff, and are able to make interventions as you go. There's this new concept of we hear a lot about exit interviews. There's some organizations that are doing stay interviews, people who aren't even leaving yet, sitting down with them and saying, what's your experience like, how's it going, and then acting on the feedback that they hear. If your organization isn't mature enough in that space yet, you're going to lose staff, and you're going to lose your staff of color. And as we know, not being able to report instances of racism, again, that lack of diversity and the rest of it. So you've got to fix that. So you've got to make sure that those 35 don't leave the sector and go elsewhere. You've got to hold on to that stuff. But that's obviously not enough. Even if you do those two things, you're still not going to have the diversity. And this is the bit that I don't think we've come on to, which is, how are we getting people, senior, experienced, successful people of color, Black people in other industries to end up and transfer and make that transition into higher education?
Right.
It's only really if you do all those three things, and I think the latter is the most important, that we're going to, in the short and even medium term, going to correct that. We need to get people who are successful in other industries to come over to HE.
Right.
And I don't see a concerted effort around that happening right now.
Understand.
A proactive, that what's happening at the moment is a lot of institutions, if they are doing something, they're trying to take lectures from other institutions.
Right.
So as soon as somebody gets appointed somewhere else, it's a loss for somebody, for us. It's just moving around the sector. What are we proactively doing? Maybe in the first instance, thinking about more temporary visiting posts and that sort of thing. And that's happening, for example, in the creative arts a bit. But really thinking about, making our sector employees of choice for people to come and move in, and we are. I think we're quite some way away from that.
It's funny because I know of in my time a few lecturers that came over from industry, and they have been the most innovative. Just a different perspective, engaging in different ways, asking different questions. And I think you're right. It's how do we because there's barriers. How do we reduce the barriers? Of that transition for people from other sectors, and then the bigger question, which I always think when it comes with kind of HR, is there's one thing to say we want to bring in more Black, South Asian, East Asian, minority ethnic or talent coming in, but will they want to stay at the place that you're bringing them to? Is there true inclusion actually there? Or will they have to fight certain battles, or will they feel uncomfortable? Will they feel a lack of sense of belonging? So my next question is, what have you seen that's worked well, or what have you been aware of or cognizant of that's actually worked well in making change in a relative time period?
Yeah, so look, I think I often find that question sometimes quite challenging, because I don't think many institutions have got it right. But I think there are pockets of good practice, and I think one of the things that I'm really encouraged by is when I see really good kind of strategies and plans which are backed up by tangible actions.
Yeah.
So where they've identified, this is the problem that we're going to solve.
Yeah.
It's the lack of diversity of staff at X level, or the disparities in experience for X, Y, and Z, right? So that's our thing. Even better is to say, over the next 3 to 5 years, we want that figure to go from X to X.
Right.
Okay. So there's an actual tangible target that we're working with, and as a result of that, these are the 3 or 4 things that we're actually going to practically do to get us there. And again, that sounds pretty basic and straightforward, but on a lot of these issues,
it's not. Yeah,
they're not there. And I think I find it really interesting as well, and it's so revealing in a sense sometimes when some leaders in fact are in certain public forums are set up to fail on some of these questions, because people say, particularly if it's at a town hall or that kind of event where they're there to hear those experiences, and somebody says, well, I've experienced X, Y, Z, what are you doing about it? And the automatic reaction is always, oh, well, we take these matters really seriously, and we're doing, we think it's very important, and it's something that we can, without, actually they should be equipped to say, yeah, absolutely, we've identified that that's an issue.
Yeah.
We're doing X, Y, Z. We're going to try it. We're not sure whether necessarily it's going to work, but this is what we're trying, because we've identified that issue. It's not the first time it's come up. We know that it's a challenge. Or to say, if it's not on your list of things that you're doing, to say, oh, that's not something that has come up. We're really interested to find out more about that. Let's consider it with the range of things we're doing. Or in some cases to say it is important, but at the moment we're prioritizing this other issue over here, which is more important, and we're going to look to work on that in the next 2 to 3 years or whatever. That's the level of the conversation that I think people want to hear and people expect. I think particularly staff are, there's a sense that they're just tired of saying the same things over and over and over again.
Yeah.
and I think as a result of that, their expectations, not their expectations, but their people are getting more and more impatient as well.
Right.
So exactly. so some of that if there ever was any kind of grace or benefit of the doubt, that's all gone.
Right. Yeah.
Because this is not something new. This is something that should have been fixed a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I think we need to get to a place where organizations, so for example, again, there are a couple of good strategies. I've not necessarily evaluated their effectiveness, but places like London Met, even University of the Arts London, you can go and you can see some really clear, tangible things that they want to be doing. University of Birmingham, there's a really comprehensive plan there. Again, I've not evaluated it, so I don't know the effectiveness, but it shows a different level of thinking in terms of practically making change to improve the experiences. Because, and I don't want to turn this into sort of almost like a mathematical exercise or something, but pretty much all those things, all those inequalities can be measured in some way.
Yeah.
Whether it's disparities in outcomes or disparities in experience, you can measure. There are tools to measure disparities in experience, tried and tested, from engagement surveys right the way through to just having a conversation.
So,
and over time, the progress should be, are those stories changing?
Right.
As an institution 2 years ago, can we see that actually over time the stories have changed? People are going from saying, I have no hope that the university can do any, work on this, to saying, we've not made all the progress that I think we could, but I've got confidence that we're on the right track. Even that is a really, really important, and stuff like that will make a huge difference on whether or not somebody is willing to stay the course, or whether they've given up hope and are going to move somewhere else.
Awesome. I think it's interesting because, even when I think about talking to students and staff about, let's say, one of the disparities, let's say the awarding gap, I often say, if you're going to talk about it, it has to be paired with what you're specifically doing to change it. It's not enough just to say this is here and it exists, but you need to kind of detail, and this is our 5-step plan. This is what we're looking to do. And allow for that communication, allow for, if you want to add to this, if you want to communicate to this, then you can, and help shape what we're trying to do in this area. Okay, so thinking a bit, take it a bit left field. So let's say you had a meeting, right, with someone at senior exec level, OVC, and there was a faculty leader, and let's say there was a lecturer, so someone frontline. What would you kind of say to them that they should be doing in this area? So if there was like one thing to move things forward at those different levels, what would you be communicating to them?
I would say just take ownership. I think there's a bit of it goes back to the previous conversation we're having, but I think there is a bit of nervousness around these issues. And for me, the leaders that I've seen who are most effective in this space are ahead of are kind of at the forefront of the discussion. So with the leaders at the front line, they're not waiting for a staff member or a student to come up to them and say, why hasn't this been done? They've thought about it. They present the challenges that they're facing before somebody else comes along and complain. And I think one of the challenges that many institutions find themselves, particularly last summer with the murder of George Floyd, is that they're on the back foot. And when everybody's on the back foot, then the way in which the responses come out are defensive, are confused, rather than really having ownership of the issue and really having that confidence there. And I think linked to that, if there is that lack of confidence, we really need to recognize that as a capability gap. and to be thinking about how do we plug that gap. Now, there are lots of ways to do it. You can do your own personal research. You can, get coached, you can get mentored, and all the rest of it. But you've got to recognize that there's that gap if you don't have that confidence to start to leading on some of these issues.
Okay. And it was interesting because I was thinking about that question as well, and it was across the board. I agree. I think there has to be this deep, I don't know if it's education, but definitely being informed of the problems, and not just in HE but societal, and the legacy and the history, and bringing it all together. And I think having a conversation about a disparity with any group, but you're in an informed place, makes for a better conversation. Better questions are formed, better dialogue has happened. And I think I almost feel like that's the starting place before we start running into action. I'm still very much for action, because for me, this is from, the awarding gap, let's say, in some of the non-continuation stats and stuff, that 20 years in the making, lots of research, lots of literature. And yet the data is still coming out that if we carry on at the rate we are, it won't close until 2071 for all groups, 2085 for specifically Black groups. And so there is a sense of there needs to be urgency to this. I almost feel at senior level, it needs to be prioritized, senior exec level. And you're right, we're seeing that more and more, hopefully in a less performative way. But then I think at the kind of middle management and lecturer level, there has to be, I think, a real engagement with expertise in this area, like a real submission and immersion, to get up to speed with it as quickly as possible. Because you're right, there are, even when I look at some situations and I'm reviewing things, there are almost nearly 50 to 100 foundational things that are not being done or haven't even been thought about, that if we're changed, small tweaks that if we're changed could have a really big impact on outcomes. What do you think can be done then when it comes to things like non-con? And obviously I'm talking about the whole sector, so not particular, but some maybe broad scale things can happen with non-continuation and this degree awarding gap. What are some things that you would say to the sector, okay, here's some basic things that we can start to do to move things forward in this area? And then I'm going to caveat that with what meaningful things you think could be done. So because there's almost a cultural aspect, the culture of an organization. There's a hard metrics, but then there's also how we talk about things and how we engage in the topic. So on those kind of the qualitative and quantitative side, how would you say would be a good way to approach it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that we've been working with universities is around student journey mapping.
Right.
And again, this, there are lots of different ways of doing this, and the principles kind of can be translated into other ways of, viewing the student journey, the student experience. But what it allows you to do, I think this is really important when it comes to awarding gaps and non-continuation rates, is do you have a real understanding of all the barriers across the whole experience? Because it's the cumulative impact of all those things that lead to these disparities. Right. Obviously, some will have more impact than others, but if you don't know what the barriers are right across that journey, if you don't know what the cumulative effects of different parts of it are, it's going to be really difficult to get that sense. And I think my hypothesis in this is that universities will be really surprised, and I think there'll be different things in different places that lead to those disparities. So for some places, it might be, particularly challenging experiences with, campus security that creates an environment that just, pushes that lack of sense of belonging slightly further in the direction that you wouldn't want it to go.
Right.
For some students, it could be the as we were talking about, the culture of the institution, or in some cases it might be a particular way in which a subject is taught that really adds to that alienation.
Mm.
But ultimately, it's the cumulative impact of all those things that leads to those outcomes. It might be student support, and I think without that really strong evidence base across the whole system,
Yeah.
it's really difficult to know where to invest time, energy, and support. And also, this might be a bit counterintuitive,
Mm.
it might not actually be the things that students themselves may think are the real challenge.
Right.
Partly in some cases because they might not have anything to compare them to. So
Mm.
they might think, oh, well, there's no hope with, the mental health service, or, the fact that I can't get access to my timetable in time with all my other responsibilities. Maybe that's just a normal thing about university, whatever. When those things might actually be some of the biggest barriers to them accessing their education and things like that. So you've really got to have a really strong evidence base for this stuff. But I think to your second point, in order for that to be effective, everyone needs to feel that they're part of this student journey and the student experience. The people in student support need to feel and understand what role that they play relative to the teaching staff.
Mm.
I think at the moment we see students in silos. I do my job. I interact with the students at this time. I get annoyed if I don't get the responses that I need, without taking into account, the time of year, or some of the other challenges or things that might be coming at students. And that again goes to the culture of the institution. Is it an institution that has really brought people together to understand that the role that they play in, creating these transformational experiences with students? Or are they just told, you're in, estates over there, you do your estates job and let us academics get on with the rest of it? So for me, that's the real thing. If it's genuinely, again, inclusive, it's including everybody in solving some of these challenges, making it clear and explaining to people, okay, so that the training is also evidence-based. That's the other thing that doesn't really happen. There's a lot of off-the-shelf stuff. There's a lot of kind of generic training. What there isn't is the conversation, which is sits down with somebody and says, right, this is your role in the student experience. By the time this person has come to your desk to explain this particular challenge or issue, this is what else is going on in their lives.
Right.
Do you have a sense of that?
Right.
With that in mind, you are now empowered to, maybe change your practice, or to consider, or to think about how, or maybe even negotiate with other parts of the institution to make sure that you can create that experience. And again, the incentives aren't aligned often in that way. The incentives are aligned to kind of get the work out the door, not necessarily to make sure that the students are having the best experience as possible. So again, that's a huge culture shift and approach, and lots of institutions will struggle with this, particularly research intensives, where they're supposed to be kind of research-led institutions, but then all these metrics are telling them we've got to be student-led and student-focused. And that kind of worked. I don't know whether this ever worked, but arguably worked at a time when you didn't have a particularly diverse student cohort, and people just kind of got made by and got through.
Right.
It's not the expectations we set for universities today. So that needs to change.
100%. Yeah. No, fantastic. Thank you for that, Amatey. Really insightful conversation. And if you would like to speak with Amatey further, he's on all great social media platforms, and open to have conversation and dialogue. I really like your idea, and I think my final question, I really like the idea of that journey mapping, because again, what I find is if one person, you spoke about this in the town hall, if one person is having an issue with something, normally that's affecting so many others, or people that will come into the institution at a later date. How do we, I think my question is a bit more, and I hope it's not evasive, but how do we begin to look at changing cultures? Because I genuinely feel, and as you laid at the outset of this conversation, that a lot of this might not have much to do with race in and of itself, but more to do with how higher education was built and created, all the way up to 92 and the rest of it. How do we begin to change these cultures in a meaningful way? almost, I guess what I'm searching for is almost given permission to change. Like, is that possible? You know, we're talking about institutions that have been around since the 1600s. Education hasn't changed itself for 100 years. Is it almost a losing battle? Do we try to adapt rather than change? What does that feel like to you?
I think it's going to take some really visionary leadership. Um, and I think it requires and is also incumbent of those of us who are working in this space as well, not to is to set our horizons even higher than I think sometimes we go. So at the moment, I find that sometimes the conversation on these issues is we've got some really tangible things that we think the university should change on race. And then we sort of talk in quite lofty language about, you know, for example, decolonizing, without actually saying there's a bit in the middle, which is actually it's not actually impossible to sit down and really imagine structurally what the university could look like. And I just feel that sometimes there hasn't necessarily been that work around what a decolonized institution looks like in practice, and rather than in theory.
Right. Yeah. And often decolonizing gets confused with inclusive curriculums or diversifying a curriculum, which are two completely different things.
Yeah.
And need two different approaches.
Absolutely. So I think it's going to require those two things. One, really visionary leadership. And you know, there's going to be some expectations as new leaders come up through the sector to really take ownership of some of these issues, but leadership at all levels. But it's also going to require those who aren't in those positions, who have been campaigning, who have been agitating for change, to really push institutions, not just to, you know, put in place particular initiatives or particular schemes, but really think fundamentally about what the university looks like, what the university feels like, and how it works. And I think there's a lot more thinking to be done. But I think the more we can push for some of those transformational changes, which will have dividends not just in race, but across the board, it will mean that, you know, there is a huge risk that the sector just becomes irrelevant in the next couple of years. If we see the way in which education and the transfer of knowledge is rapidly evolving, this kind of didactic kind of teacher holds all the knowledge, student, you know, just writes everything by rote model doesn't really exist anymore. You know,
right.
How do you teach in an environment where actually the students may, in some cases, know more or know a broader range of things in relation to the topic than the teacher,
right,
or more relevant knowledge, you know, and what does that look like? Now, we know that there are very new ways of engaging learning in that way, but unless the sector really gets on top of that and catches up with that, it will be in trouble.
Right.
So I think that's really it's gonna require change at a lot of different levels. Part of me, and maybe it's me just being optimistic, part of me thinks it will happen. Because it has to.
Right. Yeah.
You know, that it's just there'll be certain tipping points, there'll be certain events which will just keep pushing it. But I think there's a real difference between kind of being dragged into that new world versus leading and pushing the agenda in this space.
100%. And equally, I've got optimism, and that's solely come from my experience of talking to people in the sector, seeing people on the ground, lecturers and so forth, who almost have their own agency to say, not on my watch, you know, we're going to do something about this. And you spoke about this earlier, but that shift has happened in like the last 5 years, and people actually say, no, I want to make sure I do something in this space. So no, thank you so much, Amatey, for joining us. Really look forward to everything you can do for the sector in all your various roles. And we will make sure that we keep in touch with your ongoings.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan.
Awesome. Have a good one.